Thank you very, very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. I have a lot to live up to, especially that very long tenure here at the museum, and I confess that some days it really does feel that way. It's a pleasure for me to be your guide on this sort of armchair tour of Boston, which is based almost entirely on objects drawn from the MFA's collection. I want to remind you, though, that this is very much an artist's tour of the city. For unlike other organizations in Boston, like the Bostonian Society, the Mass Historical Society, the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, and other places, the MFA has never sought to document the history of our city in any comprehensive way. Our mission is a different one, and one that is concerned with art. The images of Boston that I'm going to share with you were collected not to tell the story of Boston's growth and development, but to tell the story of the history of art through the presentation of its finest and most beautiful examples. Nevertheless, I think you will agree that we can trace the history of our city through some very remarkable objects. Can I have the first two slides, please? The first thing I'll tell you is all the crooked slides, like the ones you see on the left, are courtesy of my camera, so you will excuse that right off the bat. I am a curator, but obviously not a photographer. Our tour is going to be a little bit different than the many tours of Boston that one can take today, at least at present, because I'm going to take you both around the city and through time. This tour will be both geographical and also historical. And for those of you who are veterans of the duck tours, nobody's going to have to say quack, quack for at least 45 minutes. The story of Boston, though, has to begin with its harbor, and you see two images that relate to Boston's harbor here. On the left, a painting by John Smibert, and on the right, a photograph of Boston by Nicholas Nixon, taken from Commercial Wharf. The Smibert that you see on the left is the earliest painted view of Boston. It dates from 1738, and it's extremely rare. And I have to confess, I am entirely cheating by showing it to you, because this painting is only on loan to the museum. It is not yet part of our collection, although if you'd like to make a contribution of its entire purchase price, I will certainly be happy to take it from you. Smibert emigrated to Boston from the British Isles in 1729, and he established himself here as a portrait painter. He was influential to the development of many Boston artists, particularly because Smibert introduced them to the traditions of European art. Nevertheless, there was no demand in Boston for landscape painting, only for portraits. And while Smibert often included realistic landscapes in the backgrounds of his portraits, this independent landscape, which you see on your left, is very unusual for its day. We see the city here from the vantage point of Noddle's Island, which was once a big island in Boston Harbor that hugged the shoreline just off the coast of Charlestown and Chelsea. Noddle's Island was uninhabited at the time that Smibert painted it, and it was used mostly to graze livestock. And I hope that you can see these little white dots that you can probably barely make out are sheep, which is what that island was mostly used for. Noddle's Island was used mostly to graze livestock, but in the 1830s, the island's owner formed a business called the East Boston Company, which was intended to develop the land on Noddle's Island for both housing and industry. We now know Noddle's Island is East Boston, and we might recognize its original shape, except for the tremendous landfill that's taken place at the island's eastern edge that we now know as Logan Airport. So you have to imagine you're standing somewhere, maybe with the Hyatt behind you now, looking towards Boston in the background. The modern view of our city that you see on the right is by Nicholas Nixon, a well-known contemporary photographer who teaches today at the Massachusetts College of Art. Nixon has long been interested in urban landscapes, and some of the MFA's recent acquisitions of Nixon's images of Boston are on view in the members' room if you have a chance to stop in there before you leave the museum today. Nixon's densely packed image of modern Boston still reflects the city's past in the concentric curves of its old streets, which still radiate out from the original waterfront. So it's this kind of leap through time that I'm going to look at with you today, starting with the harbor scene where the Boston story really begins. All of the earliest views of Boston have to do with the harbor. The city was first settled in the 17th century for religious reasons, and the first governor, John Winthrop, wrote a famous description of the settlement as a, quote, city upon the hill where the eyes of all people are upon us. But that wasn't based so much on the geographic description of Boston and its three hills as it was upon biblical references and Winthrop's desire to create an ideal Christian community. But commerce wasn't very far behind, and that's evident in this German map that you see on the right, dating from 1725, which shows the commercial centers of the European colonies of the New World. Here you see the hook of Cape Cod and Boston above it. This map, I might add, is also hanging in the members' room. Smybert's view likewise documents Boston's importance as a port. All of the action takes place in the water and on the wharves that reach out like arms that beckon the fleet. There are two landmarks which are just barely visible here. One of them is Long Wharf, and the other is the beacon at Beacon Hill. Long Wharf was built by merchants in 1710, and if you can believe it, it was 2,000 feet long and 150 feet wide. It accommodated 500 ships a year that represented 40% of all of the shipping in the American colonies. If you look closely at the Smybert, you can also see some of the other 57 wharves and 27 shipyards that lined the harbor and the islands. The beacon that stood up like a stick on top of Beacon Hill marked a warning zone, a military warning zone, Beacon Hill being the tallest of the three hills that mark the ridge at the center of the Shawmut Peninsula. The three hills, now only Beacon Hill survives really as a hill. The other two hills, Pemberton and Mount Vernon, survive now only as street names. And these three hills soon became known as the Tri-Mountain or Tremont, from which Tremont Street gets its name. Almost until our own day, the city was focused on the harbor, which was the source of wealth for most of its elite and the source of employment for most of its working class. And the harbor very much remains the focus of image making in Boston. Many more scenes of the harbor were painted than of any other Boston subject. And of course we have to remember in our art historical tour of Boston that harbor tours were an important subject in the history of art, from the works of Canaletto painting Venice, to Claude painting Italy, to Turner painting harbors in London and elsewhere. And American painters were well aware of that European tradition. When John Blunt made the image of Boston Harbor on your left, he was careful to inscribe it with maritime precision on the back of his panel. He wrote, Boston Harbor, January 12, 1835, 1 mile below the castle, looking to the east. Castle referred to, of course, Castle Island, which had been used for defense since the earliest days of Boston. In 1834, the year before this painting was made, construction began on a new fort there, Fort Independence, which was finished in 1851. But Fort Independence was the 8th fort to take place on Castle Island, hence its name. The artist, John Blunt, who lived from 1798 to 1835, was self-taught. He was a native of New Hampshire, but he set up his studio in Boston in 1831, where he specialized in portraits, landscapes, and marine views. Several members of his family, including his father, had been ship's captains, which might account for his topographical accuracy in the inscription on the painting on the left. Blount's work is very rare. He died when he was only 37 years old aboard the ship Ohio on a voyage from New Orleans to Boston, later the same year that he had painted this wonderful icebound view of our harbor. On the right is another harbor view, this one made by Robert Salmon, a prolific British maritime painter who emigrated to the United States in 1828. He was active in Boston and in the New England area until 1842, when he returned to England. I'm showing you on the right his view of Rainsford's Island in Boston Harbor from about 1840. Salmon shows us a very different aspect of the harbor, the activities that took place on the various harbor islands. Rainsford Island was a popular summer retreat, despite the fact that as early as 1737, the island had also been the site of a quarantine hospital for infectious diseases. It's amazing to think people would still go there for amusement and recreation, while on the other end of the island there was a smallpox hospital, but I guess they figured they were pretty safe. The building that you see here in the Grecian style was erected as the smallpox hospital in the 1830s, and later Rainsford Island also served as a poorhouse, as a veterans' home, and as a school for delinquent boys. None of the buildings are still there, but if you go out to Rainsford Island in the summer, you can see the foundations of several of these buildings. The site was described by Richard Henry Dana in his popular book from 1869, 2 years before the mast, which describes sailing in and out of Boston Harbor. And Dana writes, "At one tack we ran so near to Rainsford Island that looking down from the Royal Yard, the island with its hospital buildings, nice graveled walks, and green plats seemed to lie directly under our yardarms." The hospital was very much the setting for both leisure and business. We don't know anything at all about the artist who painted the jolly boat race that you see taking place on the left-hand screen, except that his name or her name was A.A. Lawrence and that the picture was made in 1852. It's signed and dated. It is a rowing race, which you can just barely make out, with a lot of spectators. You can see 4 men rowing here and boats of various spectators watching. The picture that you see on the right is not a scene of leisure, but a scene of work. It's an unusual early photograph of the city that shows one of its most important industries, shipbuilding and ship repairs. The photograph is a daguerreotype. It was made by the firm of Southworth and Hawes, probably in the middle 1860s. Southworth and Hawes were 2 of the most renowned photographers of the age, in partnership together from 1843 to 1862. They were known both for the quality of their work, particularly the large scale of the daguerreotype plates, but also for their interest in not only recording portrait photographs of people, but also portraits of the local landscape, something that's very difficult to do with a daguerreotype, which consists of a photosensitive film on a silver plate, and it requires a very long exposure time. So any of Southworth and Hawes' daguerreotypes tend to be images of things that stayed still, like this ship in dry dock at the Atlantic Dock in East Boston, which you see on the right. I would emphasize that the harbor, which looks entirely empty, was no doubt bristling with boats, but the long exposure time of a daguerreotype would make all of that activity disappear, just like the moving clouds disappear in the sky. The Photographic and Fine Art Journal of 1855, wrote about the accomplishments of Southworth and Hawes, stating, "The Boston daguerreotypes and photographers, as a body, probably occupy a higher place of intelligence, energy, and personal reputation than those of any other city in the United States. One of the oldest practitioners, and probably the oldest in Boston, is Albert Southworth, now and for several years past of the firm of Southworth and Hawes, Tremont Row. To their honor it be said, they have never lowered the dignity of their art or their profession by reducing their prices, but fixed aim and undeviating rule has been to produce the finest specimens of which they were capable, the finest in every respect, artistic, mechanical, and chemical." Southworth and Hawes recorded several aspects of Boston's waterfront, including views of the famous McKay shipbuilding yard in East Boston, where some of the greatest clipper ships were made. Here on the right, we see the USS Niagara, a steam screw frigate which was built in New York and commissioned in April 1857. The Niagara was the Navy's largest ship when she was built, and soon after entering naval service, the ship was sent to England to help lay the first transatlantic telegraph cable. In June 1862, after several engagements during the Civil War, the Niagara sailed to Boston for repairs, which is what you see going on in the photograph on your right. She was to be repaired and also to have her battery of guns enhanced and improved. After the war, the Niagara returned to the Boston Navy Yard, where she sat for nearly 2 decades while proposals to rebuild her as an armored warship were considered but not implemented, and the ship was sold for scrap in May 1885. This interest in the specific details of Boston's fleet and its shipping industry are also evident in the work of America's best-known painter of harbor views, Fitzhugh Lane, and I'm showing you 2 paintings by Lane from our collection here on the screen. Lane was born in Gloucester, Massachusetts. He began his career in Boston as a maker of topographical prints, but he settled back in Gloucester in 1848 and began to paint. He painted harbors all along the New England shore, Boston, Salem, Gloucester, and Ipswich, also Maine, New York, and Baltimore. I'm showing you on the left the brig Antelope in Boston Harbor from 1863, and on the right, the Britannia entering Boston Harbor from 1848. Lane most often shows the harbor from the water. It was a busy center of commerce, and the fact that Lane's views are often made from a boat is often credited to the fact that the artist was crippled from polio, and he was much more able to get around in a small boat than he was on land. Lane took remarkable care in the details and depictions of his ship, and they also document for us the transformation from an age of sail to an age of steam. The picture on the right from 1848 shows the arrival of a great steamship, and you can see its red smokestack clearly at the center of the composition. The Britannia was the first Cunard Line vessel, and her arrival in Boston for the first time in 1840 was heralded by crowds and fanfare, and that's what Lane was commemorating in this picture on the right. The ship was so admired that once, when it was caught in ice in Boston's harbor, the local citizens came out with pickaxes and shovels to clear a path for it. Hard to imagine somebody being that enthusiastic about shoveling anymore. Charles Dickens, in fact, took the Britannia to Boston when he came to the United States for his well-documented visit in 1842, later writing how much he hated the voyage. Although Charles Dickens, if you read his accounts of his trips to America, hated just about everything and everyone he saw. The painting on the left is a posthumous ship's portrait of the brig Antelope, which Lane recorded in 1863. The Antelope had been built in East Boston and was engaged in the opium trade between India and Canton. Her short but profitable career ended in 1848 when she was caught in typhoon and dismantled. Subsequently, the ship was rigged as a bark, only to be wrecked in China in 1852. The painting commemorates the last time the Antelope sailed out of Boston Harbor in 1843, bound for China. And the Cherokee, another ship built in Medford in 1827, is also visible in the background here and identified by its pennants, which you see here, those of you who are fans of ships. In the distance of this picture, we get the skyline of Boston, which is identifiable by the dome of its State House. And I'm showing you here one of Lane's most famous images of Boston, Boston Harbor here on the right from 1850 to 55. And here, too, you see just this little lump, which is the dome of the State House. I think it's these paintings by Lane, these quieter, more elegiacal images that don't commemorate individual ships that are perhaps his masterpieces. On the right, we see ships at rest, rendered equally precisely, but now in calm and quiet. The setting sun appears right over the State House, and we see an exquisite transformation of the sky from the pink of the sun to the blue of oncoming night. At the same time, this scene seems somehow poignant, like the great age of sail was in fact passing. And if you look carefully, you'll see a little white steamship just coming in on the right. Lane depended on topography to identify the individual harbors that you see in his views. And the dome of the State House, along with the spires of identifiable churches, clearly mark this picture as Boston. These features are the same features that we saw in the earliest image by Smibert, although the rhythmic punctuation of church spires has now been joined by the dome of the State House, which was completed in 1798 and clad with copper by Paul Revere in 1802. The gold leaf that we see today didn't come until 1874. The dome of the State House becomes as distinctive a landmark for Boston as the dome of St. Peter's was for Rome. And I'm showing you just an odd comparison that tickled my fancy. On the left, George Loring Brown's view of the Medfield marshes with the dome of the State House rising on the hilltop in the distance, and a view of the Roman Campagna with the dome of St. Peter's appearing like a little blop on the horizon line. I want to pause now and move inland, step away from the harbor. In the 18th century, landscape images are very rare indeed. The Smibert view I showed you at the beginning of the lecture is one of the only views of the city that was painted before 1800. And I'd remind you again that there was no market for this kind of landscape painting in the 18th century. Instead, we see Boston as a backdrop to current events, like this scene on the left, an engraving made of the Boston Massacre, which took place on March 5th, 1770. This engraving, called The Bloody Massacre in King Street, was made by Paul Revere in 1770. It was one of the many increasingly violent skirmishes between Boston citizens and the British forces who were in Boston to make sure that the new taxes on tea and many other goods were collected. And at the Boston Massacre, several people were killed, and the inflammatory engraving that Revere made was intended to incite patriots to the cause. Patriot leaders used the Boston Massacre as a distinct rallying cry for revolution. I find it interesting that the site of the Boston Massacre is commemorated rather understatedly by the small cobblestone circle that you see on the right, which, if you're trying to cross the street after you've gotten off at the Orange Line at the State House, you will see in a small traffic island with cars swimming all around you. Revere's scene, though, is backed by the old State House that had been erected in 1712, and you can see a whole street of Federal-style brick houses and warehouses leading up King Street. And I would remind you that, of course, King Street, for some reason, was renamed after the Revolution. It's now State Street. The Battle of Bunker Hill also provided an opportunity to depict the local landscape. We see it here in an engraving on the left, showing the attack as it took place. and also on the right in a decorative overmantel by Winthrop Chandler, probably made in the late 1870s. A very charming and picturesque image of the battle taking place. Chandler, whose work you see on the right, came from Connecticut. He apprenticed himself as a portrait painter in Boston, but had returned to Connecticut by the time of the Revolution. So his image is most likely based on a print, with amendments by the artist to accommodate his decorative style. But you do get the idea of the strategic importance of the Charlestown Hills, with their view of the city and the harbor in the background. I should mention, of course, as we all know, that the battle actually took place on Breed's Hill, but that didn't discourage anybody from calling it for the Battle of Bunker Hill anyway, and it went on to live in history in many paintings, most notably by the American artist John Trumbull, whose death of General Warren at the Battle of Bunker Hill you now see on your left. The features of the landscape were not considered as important as the events themselves, and in the hands of more experienced painters than Winthrop Chandler, the landscape details disappear almost entirely in favor of the events of men, even in the hands of Trumbull, who had been trained first not as an artist, but as a surveyor. Trumbull came from Connecticut like Chandler did. Trumbull went to Harvard, he served in the Continental Army, and later, in addition to diplomatic work, he became a painter, studying art with the American painter Benjamin West, who had a studio in London. Trumbull dedicated himself to portraying the people and the events of the Revolution, including the murals he made for the United States Capitol building in Washington, D.C. But in his vision of the Battle of Bunker Hill, the setting is evident only in this tiny, tiny area of the composition, the strategic importance of the site almost obscured by the main event, the death of General Warren. Trumbull turned the scene into a classical history painting, with the general expiring into the arms of his fellows in a pose that was drawn very much from art history, from Renaissance imagery that showed the crucifixion and descent from the cross. It's really the people of Boston and not their surroundings that were considered suitable subjects for art in the 18th century. They were the citizens who had ambitions and egos that painters like Joseph Blackburn, whose work you see on the left, and John Singleton Copley, whose work you see on the right, could make concrete. The artists captured their class stature in their silks and satins and the tantalizing glimpses of well-to-do estates that you see in the background. Joseph Blackburn, whose work you see on the left, dominated the art market in the 1750s. He made very sweet images of the local gentry, like Isaac Winslow and his family from 1755, which you see on the left, which Blackburn painted with great flair and a lot of stylish Rococo details. Isaac Winslow was a wealthy merchant with homes in Boston and in Roxbury, and his family is set out of doors in the latest European fashion for family portraits. The landscape in the background evokes their economic status with its luxurious garden, its gates to a grand estate, big stone gates that you can just make out here, and a swan pond in the foreground. On the right, you see Copley's portrait of Rebecca Boylston from 1767. Copley was younger than Blackburn, but surpassed him as an artist, and eventually Blackburn left Boston as more and more of Boston's elite gave their portrait commissions to the young rival. One of Copley's most important portrait commissions was from the Boylston family, who owned a luxurious mansion on School Street, and Copley made 6 portraits for them, including this one of Rebecca. The Boylston family had called themselves shopkeepers, but in fact they were very prosperous importers and considerable property holders, with land in Boston, Roxbury, Brimfield, and Bedford, and you see that alluded to in the landscape here in the background. Rebecca, who was 40 and unmarried when Copley painted her, was the mistress of her unmarried brother Nicholas's vast estate, which is implied by the decorative landscape and also by this very sophisticated fountain, a lion spurting water that you see in the background. But these glimpses of the supposed Boston landscape that you see in the backgrounds of these portraits are in fact sheer fantasy. The sources come entirely out of British engravings, like the one you now see on your left. And probably you can see a garden in the background here and a similar fountain spurting water. This is an image of the Duchess of Bolton, who I can assure you never lived in Boston. But paintings like these and their models, based on mezzotint models, allowed colonial citizens to fulfill their fantasies of having a grand European estate. And it was Copley's exceptional talent at rendering material things that make us think that their ambitions were realized. Instead, the Boylstons live on in other ways. It's an important family, so perhaps it's not surprising to find that one of the city's biggest and most important streets was named after them. The Boston landscape is marked to this day by associations between art and history. Copley is a name many of us encounter on a daily basis in our landscape as we commute on the T, go to the library or to church, shop at a mall, or watch the marathon. But not everybody realizes that, in fact, the square was named after John Singleton Copley, whose self-portrait from 1769 you see on the left. I'm going to tell you more about Copley Square in a minute, but I want to just point out that it's through their names that the 18th century Bostonians live on. Just to give you one other example, you should be thinking about his art history every time you walk through the North End, or in fact, along many of Boston's streets. These references survive all over town, and in this map on the right, you can see marked with dots the various locations where Boston's Copley sitters lived. But I'm showing this map to you also to remind you of the original configuration of Boston, an odd peninsula joined to the mainland only by this very narrow neck, which is present-day Washington Street. After the Revolution, the city immediately began to change as the first landfill projects began, first by filling in the small inlets and the areas in between the spokes of the wharves that stuck out into the harbor. And from this time forward, we see a continual reshaping of Boston physically as well as historically. In federal Boston, images of the city and the fine arts are also relatively rare, but there are a few of them. I'm showing you on the left Gilbert Stuart's portrait of Josiah Quincy from 1824. Stuart was the greatest painter during the federal period in the United States, and it's our good fortune that he lived in Boston for so many years, recording some of our best-known citizens, including Josiah Quincy, who served as a representative in Congress, as a Speaker of the Massachusetts House, as a judge, as mayor of Boston from 1823 to 1828, and then taking as his last job president of Harvard from 1829 to 1845, something that I think he thought wasn't quite as much fun as he'd had when he was mayor of Boston. I'll just tell you a little bit about why I think that. The painting that you see on the left was commissioned by Quincy's daughter, and it shows Quincy before one of his significant public achievements, an urban renewal project along the waterfront. You need to remember that the harbor used to go almost all the way to Faneuil Hall, and that the area surrounding the town dock that stuck out from Faneuil Hall was filled with oyster stalls, cats, both dead and alive, rats, and rubbish. Quincy arranged for this entire area to be filled in, pushing the harbor back to the far side of a new street, which he called Commercial Street. 3 large market buildings were to be constructed on the filled land, a granite market in the center with 2 brick warehouse buildings on either side. The entire project survives today as Quincy Market, although you must picture it with water across the street at the eastern end, right about where the new stores are now and well before the central artery. The buildings of Quincy Market, and you see the central marketplace here, were designed in a dignified classical style by Alexander Paris. And what's interesting about Stuart's portrait is that the building hadn't yet been built when the painting was made. The portrait was made in 1824. The cornerstone of this building was not laid until 1825. The market opened in 1826. The portrait was really a bit of political propaganda, espousing Quincy's plan for the marketplace before he had managed to push it through, an incident of creative local politics and power between the local aristocracy and the more populist politicians of the day, said to be so intense that it would even make our former Mayor Curley's toes curl. Somebody pointed out to me that the story of Josiah Quincy and Quincy Market is recounted in a book that is actually on the remainder table in our shop, should you choose to go there, a book called The Magic of the Many, Josiah Quincy and the Rise of Mass Politics in Boston. Mercantile Boston can also be seen in this unusual street scene on the right by a painter named Philip Harry, whom we know next to nothing about, except that his paintings were often reproduced as prints. We're now looking down Tremont Street. You can see the gates surrounding the Granary Burying Ground on your left. You can still see this view today. This is King's Chapel, still there on the right. It's an elegant street lined with fashionable figures, elegant houses, and I hope you'll see street lights, making this a very modern city indeed. Had any of these fashionably dressed people gone inside, they would probably have been greeted with a scene like this. And I'm showing you here two paintings by Henry Sargent. On the left, The Dinner Party, and on the right, The Tea Party, both from about 1820, showing you the interiors of these elegant houses that had been designed by Charles Bulfinch during the early 19th century. We see the neoclassical fashion not only of the architecture of the house, but also of the costumes the people are wearing, the furniture in the rooms, and the furnishings themselves, the silver, china, etc., some of which are now part of the museum's collection. That elegant lifestyle survived in the countryside of Roxbury well into the 1850s. And you see here a painting by J.W.A. Scott, A View of Roxbury, made in 1854. Roxbury had been the site of many fashionable country houses from colonial times throughout the 19th century. This shows you the house of one Samuel Guild, a prominent merchant and resident of Roxbury. And the street that you see winding through here is Washington Street, which led out to the main part of Boston. J.W.A. Scott had been Fitzhugh Lane's partner in a lithographic business, and you see them sharing a similar interest in topographical views. What's astonishing to me is to see how much open space there still was in Roxbury well into the 1850s. The neighborhood was not substantially urbanized until the arrival of trolleys and mass transportation in the decades after the Civil War. And Roxbury, I would add, was annexed to Boston in 1868, which was hardly a good thing. I am showing you here a photograph made in the 1960s of this same site, where just about none of it is left, although I should add that were we to go back down there, I think we would see many, many improvements in Roxbury since the 1960s. Boston had always been aware of the benefits of open space, and the common was designated as open land as early as 1640. Originally a reserve for cattle grazing and military gatherings, it was used that way well into the 1830s. And I'm showing you an engraving of Boston Common on the left by James Kidder, and on the right an anonymous painting by Mr. Anonymous, or Ms. Anonymous, I might add, which shows the Boston Common and the Hancock House that used to stand on Beacon Street at the top of the hill. Along the northern edge were some of the colonial city's most elegant mansions, like the Hancock Mansion you see here, and Beacon Hill went on to become one of the city's most fashionable neighborhoods, although I would point out that the hill above Louisburg Square was once known as Mount Whoredom, for the women who went there to keep the soldiers happy as they tended the beacon on Beacon Hill. After the Revolution, however, the soldiers went away. The area picked up considerably, and more townhouses were built along Tremont Street, which also became a wealthy neighborhood overlooking the Common. The Common continued to be used as it is today for special events, and you see here on the right William Sharp's view of a railroad jubilee on Boston Common in 1851. Sharp is best known as a printmaker and an innovator in the field of color lithography. He shows us here a celebration commemorating the completion of the railroad between Boston and Canada. A commemorative book described the occasion, saying that with the construction of a bridge across the Charles River in 1786, the great system of transportation of railroads started to be possible. And by 1851, when this jubilee took place, the system of railroads exceeded 1,000 miles, and Boston, they shyly added, was its center. The mayor remarked, "Hills have been cut asunder, valleys have been filled up, and running waters have been spanned to facilitate our communication with every section of the land. Our iron pathways are now our rivers." And the railroads took over from the age of sail, transforming Boston completely, occasioning the great landfill projects of the 19th century. Throughout this time, the Boston Common continued to provide respite for the increasingly cosmopolitan city. And the museum's best-known image of Boston Common is this one by Childe Hassim from 1885. Throughout his career, Hassam was attached to architecture, choosing to paint images of both the colonial past and also of the modern present. What's interesting about the view on the right is no matter how quaint it looks to us today, it was, in fact, a tremendously modern image of Boston. And none of Hassam's compatriots embraced the modern city as completely as he did, and none of them chose it as an appropriate subject for art. In fact, there are no urban images in oil that relate to Hassam's unremittingly modern street scenes. In 1881, King's Handbook of Boston described the city as a great, far-reaching, imposing modern town that has taken the place of the bustling, picturesque, revolutionary Boston. And the new Boston, with its magnificent wealth of buildings, is most attractive. It's that new Boston that Hassam is showing you here. The elegant federal row houses were all gone now, replaced with commercial red brick buildings that had been built largely in the 1870s and 80s. This was now no longer a residential district, but a lively commercial area. The red brick buildings were new. The trolley cars that you can see here lined up in rush hour traffic mark the bustling exchange of a winter afternoon. An artificial light glows from gas streetlights and from storefronts where electricity had been introduced in 1881. Hassam enhanced his idea of the fast pace of city life by including a perspective scheme that makes us rush back into the distance, just as the trolley cars are trying to rush on the left-hand side. The Common had also been substantially transformed. We see here on the left the Tremont Street Mall, which had been constructed along the Common in the 1850s, one of 5 tree-lined walkways that were intended to turn the Common into one of the great city parks like London or Paris. The Common once bordered a harbor inlet, and Boston citizens had joined with Mayor Quincy in an effort to keep the land west of Charles Street as a public space. The Boston Public Garden, which you see here in 2 views, on the left by George Loring Brown and on the right by Arthur Goodwin, the garden had started in the 1830s. It was incorporated as a botanic garden in 1839 and laid out with ornamental and exotic trees and plants. People continued to make proposals for the city to sell the land for development, but fortunately that never happened, and the city began to protect the public garden by law in 1859. You see here two views, both of which incorporate Thomas Ball's memorial statue of George Washington, which was erected in the public garden in 1869. Despite the tremendous buildup that happened with the filling in of the Back Bay in the 1870s and 80s, Bostonians were very conscious of the need to protect open spaces, and a variety of plans were proposed to create a green space throughout the city. You see here on the left one by Charles Davenport, which was never adopted, in 1874, proposing a tree-lined park along the Charles River. On the right, you see a Boston Park Guide that was published in 1895 and advertised with a very attractive Art Nouveau poster by Charles Woodbury. Eventually, as we all know, Frederick Law Olmsted devised the Emerald Necklace to bring park space throughout Boston down to Franklin Park. The scene that we see here in Childe Hassim's Charles River and Beacon Hill was new land, part of this landfill, which the park became also a part of. This is the Charles River Embankment. I would add that the Charles River Embankment Company was incorporated in 1881. They built the Mass Ave Bridge, which was deadlocked with traffic if you tried to get here today. They also dredged the shores of the river to create neat embankments and desirable new property that became as desired as the water side of Beacon Street. And what you see here is Bay State Road, which was laid out in 1889. One critic remarked of Hassam's paintings, he sees beauty in what many would reject as unworthy of serious art. I'm comparing a modern view of the square on the left with a view by one K. Calhoun showing Copley Square in 1911, just before the original building of the Museum of Fine Arts was torn down to be replaced by the Copley Plaza. In the 1870s, this area was called Art Square, and in 1883, the land was purchased by the city and dedicated to one John Singleton Copley. In the wake of the centennial of the American Revolution, Bostonians chose to look to the past and to honor a colonial painter. But I would point out that Boston is one of the few cities in America where a great major public square is named after an artist. One of the best-known modern painters to record the late 19th century Boston was Maurice Prendergast, a painter who came to Boston from Newfoundland and grew up here as a child. He's known for his images of Boston parks, like the scene you see on the left of Franklin Park on the left, or South Boston Pier on the right, both of these from the late 1890s. And he captured many of these public spaces that had been planned for the benefit of the general populace. This wonderful curve of a pier on the right was at Castle Island, which in 1890 was transferred from the federal government to the city of Boston, and Olmsted designed its wonderful park. Prendergast and others also captured Boston's hidden green spaces, like Prendergast's view on the left of the park in front of West Church in Boston in 1900. The view you see on the right is of Lewisburg Square on Beacon Hill in 1941, made by a man named Louis Novack, a printmaker who was active in Boston in the 40s and 50s, trained at the Massachusetts College of Art. So some artists chose to show urban Boston and its open spaces, while others retreated from the modern city, representing instead rural survivors, like John Joseph Enneking, who showed the old Roundy House on the Neponset River in Dorchester on the left, or Samuel Jerry, who showed Mays Pond in Roxbury on the right. Arthur Clifton Goodwin was one of the few artists of the late 19th century to consistently show urban Boston. You see here his view of Old South on the left, Dartmouth Street from Copley Square, and on the right, down Mount Vernon Street from 1914. Goodwin worked in both Boston and New York. He made many, many images of the city. He had started his career as a dandy and a dancer, only turning to painting after 1900, and the quality of his work varies a great deal depending on how much he had had to drink before he started to paint. He was joined in his love of the modern city by John Wharf, a prolific watercolorist and oil painter who studied at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. I'm showing you two examples of Wharf's watercolors here: Rush Hour, South Station on the left, and on the right, Winter in East Boston in 1933. Wharf had been encouraged to pursue watercolor painting by John Singer Sargent, and he exhibited his work annually for over 30 years. Some of the most interesting views of modern Boston at the beginning of the 20th century were made by George Lukes, a member of the Eight, the so-called Ashcan School of New York. Lukes was a friend with the Boston painter Margaret Sargent, and he made a visit to Boston in the 1920s, painting these two views of row houses in Boston, on the right, Beacon Street, and on the left, St. Botolph Street. In the 1940s, few artists turned their attention to the city, and I'm showing you here two paintings that I have to say I have never seen on view here at the Museum of Fine Arts, both done in the late 1940s. On the left, an image by Thomas Francioli showing Beacon Hill, and on the right, Polly Thayer's Spring Morning on the River from 1947. This obviously looking across the Charles to the Dome at MIT. This one taken from a similar location looking back towards Beacon Hill. Both Boston's grand public spaces and its alleyways continue to inspire artists. I'm showing you here two works from the 1970s, another Nicholas Nixon photograph of the Mother Church from 1975 to represent the wonderful grand public spaces that still become subjects for art in Boston. And on the right, a meticulous watercolor by David Campbell, Backs of Houses and Church, early spring from 1979. The city is very much still a suitable subject for art, and I wanted to close just by mentioning that it is still very much something the Museum of Fine Arts encourages. Some of you perhaps might know the work of Andrew Haynes, who works here in the Museum of Fine Arts as our frame conservator. This is his view of Huntington Avenue on the left in 2001 and the Arbor Way in 2002. I wanted to show you that many artists still have very strong ties to the Museum of Fine Arts, and it's a pleasure to have given you an armchair view of some of their work today. Thank you.